What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Coach Ben podcast on Jiu-Jitsu Magazine Podcast Network. I'm here with my co-host, Jim. Jim, as always, brings in our guest. So, Jim, please bring in our very special guest today.
Right on, Ben. Thank you for that. Today, we have just a multi-level champion in both the jiu-jitsu world and the MMA world. He's worked with many of the top fighters, both, again, jiu-jitsu and MMA. The one and only Robert Drysdale. How you doing, sir?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, guys. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the opportunity.
And we just
Thanks, Robert.
we just talked about you're out in Vegas, and you just said the weather's getting nice over there. And how's the whole COVID situation been treating the jiu-jitsu community in Vegas, the MMA community?
It was rough in the beginning, no one expected anything like this. It's funny because my whole life I've never made New Year's resolutions or anything like that. I just go on with my life. But this year I did. I had all these plans,
Go figure. Yeah. So we have you to thank. Thanks a lot for that.
Oh man, my luck. But
hey, Jim, sorry, Robert, real quick. I just want to make sure everybody that's listening, I know a ton of my students listen to this, and Robert has been, he's one of the legends of the sport, and I think a lot of people, they haven't seen, a lot of your matches, Robert. I know you won ADCC in the absolute division, I believe in 2007, correct?
Yes.
And you were a black belt in what year?
2004, I got my black belt.
Okay. So, the year after I started jiu-jitsu, you were already a black belt. So I know you mainly as an MMA coach and an MMA fighter. And I know you as I believe you're one of the first Americans to win a world championship. You're one of the first Americans to win ADCC. You're very well known for getting Marcelo Garcia into that I believe it was an anaconda choke or something like that. That was a very famous video. You have matches with Roger Gracie that I watch all the time just to see little details that you guys are doing. So yeah, just wanted to make that clear. Jim,
I
so
want to correct one thing.
Ahead, Robert.
The details that Roger's doing, I didn't do shit those fights. That's all him.
Oh.
I'm just getting my ass whooped those fights. I can never get over it.
What was something in that fight that you remember? Because you fought Roger a couple times, I'm guessing.
3 times, yeah. Man, I never scored an advantage on the man. It kills me. Like, I never scored an advantage on him. But it's just, I hate using the word because when you say strong, people assume you're saying he's not good. And that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying he's stupid strong. Like, it doesn't look like it. Like, it taught me a lesson. Like, guys like him and Garcia, they teach you a lesson that strength has nothing to do with size, despite, like our cartoonish approach to athletics. If you're big, therefore you're strong. And it's like, no, I've rolled with bodybuilders. They're actually pretty weak. And then you get guys like Garcia, like tiny, but their isometric strength is through the roof,
What do you think they're doing?
I think it's largely genetics. I think it's 90%. They're not unaware of it. They'll say, no, I do this exercise, that exercise. I do those exercises too, and I don't have that kind of, like, I'm normal. I think most people, and occasionally you get people that are exceptionally good at something. And, of course they train and they can perfect it, but I think it's mostly genetics.
Yeah, I see. See, now when you say that, I know you're a high-level coach, because that's something that I have kind of figured out over time on my own too, is a lot of these details that make the greatest, competitors great. It's almost like it has to be genetic. It's unknowable. They can't teach you. You can't figure it out. You can't. It's unknowable.
Example I always give. I'll show a move in class. Same information. 30 people in class. Same exact information. Everyone's listening to the same details. 5 people are able to pull off that move that same day. The other 25 will never be able to do it. Like, how do you explain that if they're all the same? People learn different. They absorb information different. They have different body intelligence. Is something we don't talk a lot about in athletics. But I've seen people that never read a book and were semi-illiterate. So we would call them, oh, you're not intelligent. But when it comes to their body intelligence, they're geniuses. Like, they can move their bodies, and like it's just a very specific kind of intelligence that we don't consider it intelligence, but I do. And I learned this in jiu-jitsu. Like, there's some people just get it, and they get it quickly. and it's not all the same. And like it's the romantic view. The ideal view is, oh, it's going to be this way. Everyone is the same, and it's just a matter of working hard. Like working hard is the key ingredient. I'm not saying it's not, but there's a blueprint, and then that blueprint is unchangeable. Like it is what it is. Like, you know, if you're tall, you're never going to be a good gymnast. If you're short, you're never going to play in the NBA. It's that simple, right? And it's the same with jiu-jitsu. These things do play a role. It's just that people don't like to talk about them because, you know, it leads some people to think that they can never be good at jiu-jitsu, which is not the case. Jiu-jitsu probably has more flexibility than any other sport, if anything, because it's so technical, right? So there's, even if you're non-athletic, you can make it all the way to the top because you can compensate with all these other things. You know, it's not, athletics is not the only thing, you know, in jiu-jitsu. It's a very brainiac sport, and that's why it's so interesting.
Yeah, I often tell my students and just people that want to get good at something like jiu-jitsu that they have to kind of make it their own. They have to, I can't give you a blueprint that works for me. I can't give you a blueprint that works for, you know, Robert Drysdale, the ADCC champion. And I often tell people that, you know, even if, let's say you, Mr. Robert Drysdale, was to have the blueprint for how you became, you know, ADCC champion, world champion, even if you started back with that blueprint, you may not be able to replicate. You know, there's things that happen that are, I just always say it's unknowable, you know, and you know, it's not a truth that people like, because, you know, we can't sell things to you know, people if we tell them, hey, you have to figure it out on your own, you just got to get in there. You know, there's a lot of, you know, it would be hard to sell, you know, DVDs, right? But I think DVDs and all these things are all good for motivation. You know, they're all good to get ideas, to get concepts. Got to make it your own, you know. So yeah.
And if you learn through DVDs, jiu-jitsu will be awful. Yeah, you hit the nail on the head, and I agree with you. Like, DVDs are great for motivation and giving you ideas, and that's what you should take from them. They're not teaching you jiu-jitsu. You understand the difference. What's going to teach you jiu-jitsu is getting your ass kicked every day. And people don't like to hear that, but that's the truth. You're going to learn by failing. It is failure that teaches you. It's not, because failure leads to self-reflection, right? Success doesn't. Success leads to a pat on the back and like, oh, I feel great. But no one ever learned anything by feeling great. You improve by feeling like, oh man, I suck. I got to go back to the drawing board. What did I do wrong? And that exercise is what makes you better, right? So it sounds contradictory, but you actually, you know, you're better off losing in the gym every day than winning.
Yeah, and you know, you mentioned I mean, you repeatedly said, I think what's a very important word in that whole process is feeling. You have to feel it to believe it, you know, because if you just learn via video, you have no contextual feeling of what's right, what's wrong, and, you know, how to do it when someone's putting that pressure on you, and making the adjustments to resist against, you know, that cool YouTube technique you just witnessed, right?
It's the difference between memorizing a move and learning a move. And I think there's a lot of that going on in jiu-jitsu where people think it's the same thing. This is where, like, a lot of people, and I don't mean to disrespect anyone, but I feel like sometimes these things aren't said because, you know, you're a hater if you're criticizing. Like, there's a lot of hoaxes out there, like people that don't know jiu-jitsu, but if they act like they do, like, I'll give you an example. Imagine, okay, think of a guy who's like well-spoken, a guy like Tony Robbins, right? If Tony Robbins taught a jiu-jitsu seminar, he'd kill it, because he'd be able to talk. He'd memorize one De La Riva sweep, and he'd talk about it with such eloquence and with such rhetoric. He'd take the crowd over, and people would be walking off that seminar going, this is the best jiu-jitsu seminar ever. But does that make Tony Robbins a jiu-jitsu master? Or expert, for that matter? Like, it does, but like, people get these things confused. And a lot of times the people who are, you know, there's a lot of things about jiu-jitsu. It's nothing to do with how you express it, how good your memory is, but like how much you understand the position with feelings, that the body intelligence that I'm talking about. I'll give an example. When a student asks me questions, I'm terrible at answering the question without grabbing onto a gi. The second I hold on to the gi and they say, what would you do in this position? I have like 20 answers. But if you ask me that question, like driving in the car, I struggle to find a single one of them because I have not memorized jiu-jitsu. I feel jiu-jitsu. So like, I have to be in your guard. I have to be in that half guard to answer the question, and immediately the wheels start turning, right? because they're very different kinds of knowledge. And I feel like one of them is very real and practical, and the other one is just for show. The other one is just for, just talk.
Right. And you also started as an athlete too, right? You weren't a coach, starting up. You were more, you were the one competing, correct?
Yes, I actually funny. Like I had zero expectations for myself as an athlete. I was mediocre at best at everything I've ever done in my life. Like, and then, but both my parents are teachers, and I felt like, oh, I can be a good teacher. I'm definitely going to be a good jiu-jitsu coach. But then I started competing and I started doing better, and like over time I became more confident, and I became a better competitor. But my goal in jiu-jitsu was always to be, I always knew I could be a good coach. But yes, I started as a competitor, and then slowly my careers, I probably kind of shot myself in the foot because I was always the coach and an athlete at the same time. I'm fighting MMA and I'm cornering UFC title fights at the same time. That's probably not a good thing to do. I should have kept things separate.
And you're training
maybe too much.
fighters.
And I'm training fighters, and I'm teaching seminars, and I'm running a team, and I have my ambition probably is my.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that actually. That was something that's always kind of like it was a question that always bugged me is, can I still be a high level jiu-jitsu practitioner and be a very, very good coach? And I don't mean like high level, like, I'm going to win the worlds or win ADCC, but be competitive, because in my head, and I've spoken to a lot of coaches about this, when you're a coach, when you own a jiu-jitsu school, it's almost like you have to know a lot more than you really need for competition, because in a competition, I might only use 3 or 4 moves and I want to go to my A game. But when I'm teaching a class, I have to know things that I might not actually play because, there's different people, different body types in my gym, So
Yeah.
what do you think about that?
It's hard because I started teaching when I was 19 years old. I was a purple belt. And because I had to back I was never rich. Like I have to pay for my tournaments. I was in Brazil at the time. I had to drive. I had the gas is expensive, the tolls, the tournaments, all that costs. Like, so I had to teach to finance my jiu-jitsu career basically. So I didn't really have a choice. But if I could choose, I think people would be better off. I recommend people not teach seminars if they're athletes, not teach classes for as long as they can. If you can make your living from just sponsors and maybe got money, I would recommend that if you could. It's just not always realistic, but I'd keep them separate. If I had a time machine, I would have not had opened a gym when I did. If I could go back to 2008 when I opened a gym in Las Vegas, end of 2008, I would have not had opened a gym. I would have stuck to my MMA career. I would have not coached. I would have not traveled so much. I would have focused exclusively on my MMA career. I think I would have gone a lot further, and then I would have had better credentials to do what I'm doing now. It's just that I like to teach. So when people ask me to train them, I couldn't stop myself. But to answer your question, man, like if it's ideally you keep these things separate.
Right. Okay. So I kind of, in my head, I kind of am, battling that like every day. How do I hang with, the MMA fighters that come and train with me and, not get my ass kicked every day and still, learn jujitsu and coach jujitsu, spend most of my time coaching as opposed to focusing on myself. So, anyway, I wanted to change gears a little bit. Most of this podcast, I want to spend talking about a documentary that you are producing, correct? It is called Close Guard, The Origin of Jiu-Jitsu in Brazil. And Jim sent me a trailer, and I watched it a couple times last night, and I just watched it right before we got on here. And it looks great, man. It looks like, it's great production value. It looks like you're going to Japan. You're going to the Kodokan. I recognize the Kodokan right away. I think that's a very important place. If you're going to go to Japan, that's where you want to start. There's that Kodokan. There's the old Kodokan. You're in Brazil, obviously. So how did this come about? How did this start?
Yeah. So I'm a history major. I have an unfinished master's. I've always liked academics. As a child, like I obsessed over encyclopedias and civilizations. That was like that's way older than jiu-jitsu. That's much older. I just kind of put all that on hold because I figure I can always, read a lot of books and study when I'm older. I won't be able to fight when I'm older, so I want to put my energy into this. Plus, I was having too much fun with jiu-jitsu. But once I retired, I guess like that passion got reignited. Yeah, so my goal was always to, I fell in love with jiu-jitsu and I kind of put all the other passions on hold. I always want to learn how to play a musical instrument, like that's on hold. I like history books, that's on hold. It was just like jiu-jitsu, but once I retired, I guess I realized that I was going to beat Bushisha. So at some point, you're not going to beat the C Quamir. And then to me, well, I'm really pushing now. I'm like, okay, let's see what else is out there. And that's when I started. Like, I was always a little skeptical of the history of jiu-jitsu because I know enough about history to know that things are never as they are told. It's always more complicated. There's always that super important character that everyone neglects. There's always that one event. There's always that narrative that is normally biased towards the people who tell it. And when I say this, I'm always careful because when I say these things, people immediately assume by default that our narrative is an anti-Gracie one, right? And we went through huge efforts, not on the opposite end of the spectrum, but to be right down the middle, which still sounds like anti-Gracie because we're including other characters, and that invariably takes some of the wind out of the sail of Helio and Carlos. And it's not that they're not important, it's just that they're not the only characters in the story. There are events that are very important. There are things that were said that were either exaggerations or straight out not true. And we know there's some of them for a fact. Some of them, it is a matter of interpretation, and you can interpret it in different ways. But, there's reasonable interpretation. And there's just like, you're just really, you're trying to construe a narrative that suits your, whatever you already believe in, and you're trying to distort the facts in that way. So it was an enormous effort for our team to try to be as unbiased as possible. And that's really what I wanted to do. I never wanted to attack or take credit from anyone, but to give credit to the people whose voices were never heard, and give a more complete account of how BJJ came to be.
I think it's important what you said, Robert, about the part where you want to tell an unbiased story. And I think this, you can see this in other things in life, right? Where somebody who writes the history sets the frame. So maybe Helio and the Gracies, they set a certain frame. So the expectation is we already have this expectation, and it's not their fault if they were a little biased in the telling of their story. I would have probably told it the same way. But there are maybe in telling your own story or their own story, they may have forgot certain characters or details, and that's what you're trying to maybe shore up in this document. And I really like that. I think that's it's fair. So yeah, that's really good.
So Robert, it's such a massive effort to re-educate, because we have this this thought process right now, and Brazilian jiu-jitsu specifically, our self-identity and what the narrative has been for so long. And I think it is very important to have a better sense of self, whether it's individually or as part of a culture, so then you could shape and get the optimal benefits of being a part of that culture, right? So with this massive project that you took part in, where do you start? Where do you even start with all of this? I mean, does it start in Brazil, or no? You go to Japan. Okay, does it originate in Japan? I mean, this is literally the name of your title, the origins, right?
And it's a very good question. Actually, one reason why we're late is because originally we were going to start, Maeda in Brazil, because that's the starting point for the story for most people, right? And then like, wait a second, there's such a rich story that comes before this. Let's include this rich history. But then the project got a little too out of proportion, and what should be a 10-episode docuseries, it's condensed in 90 minutes. Which, I think that it's difficult to strike that balance, but I think we've done a good job. We have a film ready. What we're missing is rights for copyright. Copyrights is a scary, scary thing. You guys, you own a magazine, you know what I'm talking about. Like, it's a scary, scary thing. So we want to be bulletproof, and we're a little late on some permissions for copyrights, but we have a film. We just can't release it yet. So that's the holdup at this moment. But it's a lot of work, man. It's a lot of work. It's been 3 years of my life, me and my team, learning a lot about jiu-jitsu, trying to tell a narrative, and knowing where to start was, I mean, we're starting with, I'll give you a little bit of scope of the film, or what we're doing. We decided to start with Commodore Perry's gunboat diplomacy towards Edo in 1854. Now, why do we decide with that particular moment? Because, if you're going to trace jiu-jitsu's history, you're going to go back to judo. And if you go a little bit further back, you're going to find that judo is a product of what was happening in Japan, the changes Japan was going through while it tries to modernize. Judo is an attempt at modernizing ancient traditions, older traditions, right? So judo is the modern version of jiu-jitsu, long story short. But why is Japan modernizing? Now we go back to Commodore Perry. I mean, we can go back to feudal Japan. We can go back in prehistory too. It's just that at some point we have to have a starting place. And Commodore Perry's, and I don't, hesitant to use the word invasion here, but pretty much pointing the cannons and going, open up to capitalism, or we're going to, send you back to the Stone Age. And the shogun, concedes. He's not stupid. So that friction, that motion, that the conflict between East and West gives rise to judo, because judo is ultimately a product of what the styles of jiu-jitsu that Kano had trained, and sumo wrestling. There's a lot of sumo wrestling, which is much older than all of this, and Western wrestling, because now the Western ideas are making their way into Japan. So he's influenced by wrestling as well, not just wrestling technique, but also Western ideas. Things like education, physical education, sport, even Western philosophers are influencing Jigoro Kano. So Jigoro Kano's product, like his baby, which is judo, the Kodokan, is really at the center of this new Japan, this rising Japan, right? This Japan that is coming out of feudal age late and is like rapidly modernizing. And Jigoro Kano, when you think about it, he's a very brilliant man. Personally, I don't think his true genius was as an artist, but in terms of politics, the man was brilliant. When you think about it, he convinced the Ministry of Education that teaching children how to fight was a great idea for their education. Now, today we take that idea for granted because, martial arts is great for education. But think about it from, early 20th century, Japan has just began to modernize, and he's convincing the Ministry of Education that teaching children how to fight is a great means to education. Like, it doesn't even make sense. But somehow he pulls it off, and he creates the space for all of us to have a job. It's brilliant. And so that we talk about that. We talk about the history of judo, because you can't talk about BJJ without talking about judo, because the truth of the matter, and this is where some of my Brazilian friends go crazy over this, like, oh, Robert's a hater, but it's the truth. What Brazilians were practicing, the Gracie family included, was judo. They were practicing judo all along. That's what it was. I mean, you want to be really technical about it, it still is judo. We're not practicing Brazilian jiu-jitsu, we're practicing Brazilian judo. It's modified judo. It's just that, they called the jiu-jitsu for so long, the name stuck. But in reality, what we're practicing is a specific format of Kodokan judo, specializing in an aspect of Kodokan judo that Jigoro Kano neglected. It was a mistake. He neglected the ground, tactical error, and it allowed the space. It created a vacuum for what we call Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to exist, long story short. And we wanted to talk about that more than focusing on the relationship between, who taught Maeda, who did Maeda teach, and the lineage, and everyone obsesses over that. And that's in the film as well. But to me, these other aspects were more interesting, to be honest.
Yeah, I've seen, probably 100 times now how many, Hickson fighting the guy on the beach. I've seen these, the kind of like the same stories, and we never get past this period, and I think it's going to be real exciting to go, farther back and tie in some of these things. I've seen so many of the same stories told and just shown in this, different settings. And, it's just going to be nice. It's going to be good. Jim, did you have any other questions for Robert about this movie that we should get to? I wanted to ask Robert some different questions.
Well, yeah, I do. As a matter of fact, it's not necessarily a question as it is just to kind of shine a light on the historical aspect of what you said about how modern Brazilian jiu-jitsu is essentially a modified version of judo, right? And I think that's a great point because, what I feel a lot of people do not realize is that wasn't jiu-jitsu, it was the art of the samurai, correct? It was the martial art of the samurai that involved more sword play, more hand-to-hand combat. But then as the empire fell, wasn't jiu-jitsu then outlawed? And
Well,
it had to be modified into this judo that we know?
somewhat like so. Like there's some. Yeah. So first of all, I'll tell you a little story. I was corrected on this because my approach going into this was very similar to yours. And there's some things you said are true, and some things are like slightly because first of all, I have never seen any evidence that the samurais created jujitsu. And I something I that in my head I was fixed that was the case because that's what everyone has always said.
Well, not created, but practiced. That this was their art.
Very, very good. That's exactly the way to put it.
Mhm.
But there's this misconception, right? And I'd never seen anything, but I believe that. And I was going around saying stuff like that. In fact, it was in the film until I was corrected by one of the historians that was consulting for us. His name is Roberto Drysdale. And he corrected us and goes like, "Oh, the samurai had nothing to do with jiu-jitsu. They might have been practicing it the same way Marines practice MMA, but that doesn't mean they're at the forefront of MMA. They're just practitioners, right?" Like that's a great point. I never thought of it that way. Um, but undoubtedly, there was a martial tradition in Japan that came from the feudal age, and perhaps, and this martial tradition is interesting. It did exist in other countries. It wasn't only in Japan, but the feudal age in Japan was extended, like way into the modern age in a lot of ways. So Japan, because it closes itself off, these traditions survive, like sumo wrestling, for example, and the styles that the Hitoryu, like for example, the Kano practice, and these styles they make it into the modern age, but they have to be modified, right? So what was called the term jujitsu, like there's a lot of confusion. The term jujitsu before Jigoro Kano was a very encompassing term. It's kind of like saying martial arts. Oh, I practice martial arts. It says something, but not a whole bunch of what you actually do. Now, if you don't care at all, it's all the same stuff. But if you're a martial arts practitioner, it matters if it's judo or taekwondo. Not the same. Like when my dad would tell me, "Drop, you got to stop playing karate. You got to get a job." It's like, it's not karate.
Right. Right.
But and so before that, jiu-jitsu was a more encompassing term. The problem is that when the Japanese start migrating to the West, the term judo has not taken over yet. The term judo is there, but it's still a school specific to Jigoro Kano. So a lot of the Japanese, including the Japanese from the Kodokan, when they're leaving, they're teaching around the world, they're using the terms jujitsu and judo interchangeably. In the West, they mean the exact same thing. In Brazil, the term jiu-jitsu really caught on. It became very, very common. And as Brazilians start splitting away from the Japanese, primarily due to Carlos and Helio and their effort, right, and their persistence in existing outside of judo, it's almost like a silent agreement. You can call yourself judo, I'll call myself jiu-jitsu. And the term judo became increasingly associated with the Olympic format, and jiu-jitsu became increasingly associated with what the Brazilians, primarily the Gracie family, were practicing in Brazil, which is just them focusing on the aspects of judo where they had a chance at surviving because they could not handle the Japanese. They could not hang with the Japanese on their feet. So they got good wherever they had a chance. Okay, this is where we have the best odds of defeating the Japanese. So that's what we're going to specialize in for other reasons as well. But like long story short, that's what's going on. But the term jiu-jitsu and judo, like jiu-jitsu is a much older term. It's just that it's incorrectly Brazilians began to use the term jiu-jitsu as if it were something outside of judo, and it was basically Kodokan judo.
And now with the story that did get out, especially when I say get out, I'm shifting towards the North American understanding of judo jiu-jitsu, right? But by the time it got to us, it seemed like, and Ben mentioned it earlier with the Hicks and Gracie fight on the beach. It seemed like there were these cliques, these little subcultures within the culture, right? These teams. And before we started this, Ben and I were talking about the kind of the vibe or the outlook of the culture here in the States when the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu movement started here in the mid 90s. The title Crianche was
Yeah.
very powerful because you had these camps, these certain camps, Camp A versus Camp B, whereas now it's a little bit more, watered down seems bad, but I'll say it's more inclusive now to where, how do you think this has been developed through the history? Like, how did that come from jujitsu into the States, and how has it proliferated into that tribal mindset? Does that make sense?
So yeah, so it would be unfair to say that Brazilians never added anything to jiu-jitsu, because I've always made the case that the Japanese, there's nothing that the Japanese, nothing Brazilians were doing that the Japanese didn't do before. The difference is in the 90s, the Brazilians just take off. Like Brazilian jiu-jitsu as an art on the ground in the 90s, it just takes on way ahead of the Japanese. No one can keep up with what we now call Brazilian jiu-jitsu in terms of ground fighting, right? But it wasn't always the case. Like Brazilians, a lot of times they were behind the Japanese. But the biggest change was cultural. Um, what happens, what we now call Brazilian jiu-jitsu went through a cultural change. I mean, they not much of Kodokan remained. The respect, the bowing, like a lot of it got lost somewhere along the way. And instead we end up with the surf culture. All right. Like in a joking way, I call it the Hakuna Matata culture, like the flip flops, the board shorts, the shaka, acai at the beach. And if you look at most Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioners, they embody more the surf culture than, Japanese culture, for example.
Yeah.
Where they behave very differently on and off the mats for the most part. Talk about exceptions, but that there's more of a relaxed beach, which is from Rio de Janeiro, which in turn is borrowed from Southern California. So in some way, that beach culture is coming back to the U.S. with a Brazilian twist. But there's more to it. Like there's something about the Latino machismo culture. Like you're a man, you're supposed to fight, no one interferes. Like the Hicks and Gracie on the beach is a one-on-one fight, no one interferes. I don't know if it's a very interesting point. When Jigoro Kano's thinking self-defense, he's thinking, multiple opponents. When most people think self-defense, but in Brazil, there's this culture of one-on-one, and that's how it was over there. As a kid, the most embarrassing thing you can think of happening in a fight is one of your friends jumping in to help you. That's like the most embarrassing. It's one-on-one. Like it's a rule. Like kids respect it, man. Like it's funny. There's more honor in the kids fighting in the playground than adults. I feel like no one pulled a gun. You couldn't pick up. It was one-on-one. That was the rule. Like you cannot stop it until one of the two quit. So I think some of that, lingered in jiu-jitsu. And you got to remember too, like jiu-jitsu as practiced by the Gracie family, right? The Gracie version of judo. It became very idiosyncratic over time. They're basically isolated. Like they create this little hub in Brazil, and it's just them. It's a niche. And it's throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, it's almost dead. We're not a lot of practitioners. People think, Brazil, jiu-jitsu was huge, and it was never big in Brazil. I grew up in Brazil, I'm telling you. I had never heard of jiu-jitsu until Royce Gracie come along. And that's the case for every Brazilian you know. It was not popular outside of Rio de Janeiro and Manaus maybe, but for the most part, most Brazilians have never heard of it.
Until Royce Gracie came along, Robert, in the UFC?
Yes, absolutely.
Wow.
Up to then, I had never heard of jiu-jitsu. Most Brazilians have not heard of jiu-jitsu. Marcio Cruz Pedipano, he told me that he's from Rio de Janeiro, and he had never heard of jiu-jitsu or the Gracie family growing up until Royce Gracie. Just to give an idea.
Wow. People in the States generally think that everybody is in a gi in Brazil. I think that's the common thought, right, Jim?
Well,
Yeah.
At the same time, it blew up in the U.S. And for the same reasons. Brazil had more teachers. That's the only reason it grew faster in Brazil. Brazil had an organized league sooner, and it had more teachers to teach it, but it was never big as it is now, for example.
So it's just like a couple years ahead of the U.S. maybe in terms of, like black belts, for example.
Exactly. It's a myth. There was no jiu-jitsu in my town until Royce Gracie come along, and there was on the black belt that had always been a black belt, but he wasn't teaching. After Royce Gracie, he was like, okay, I'll put my black belt back on and I'll go back. That's exactly what happened.
So I think that you bring up a really important point, Robert, that we're a lot more connected than we think. People think, in Brazil, it's this different thing. There's a lot more connection. There's a lot more global, stuff going on than people realize.
100%. And because they were such at a detriment terms of like their rivalry was judo. Like they didn't have government funding like judo did. The private sector is not investing. So they end up with small mats, niche practice. They get very competitive because they know how to fight. They're good. They're dedicated. How do we prove ourselves? Well, we prove ourselves through challenges. We prove ourselves through dojo storming. We prove ourselves through fighting on the street. Like it becomes very tribal because they have to shine. It's what, Tufi in his PhD dissertation calls the Gracie patrician ethos. And I think that's a huge ingredient in the story. Is like these people are dedicated. They have an obsession with shining where we will rise above no matter what. And you got to admire the ambition. I don't always admire the methods, but the ambition is something I could admire. Like they had this, like we're gonna shine no matter what the cost is. Like we belong in a special place. We're not just, they have this ambition. And I think that's a key ingredient for jiu-jitsu existing, because had it not been for that ambition, we would have been absorbed by judo and we would all be practicing judo today. It's because of that ambition for carving a space for themselves. And by consequence, by creating a space for Brazilian jiu-jitsu to exist, that I have a job. But it's interesting to me that it is very, very tribal. It's very primal. It's not very honorable, if you ask me. Like in the judo Japanese sense of the word, I don't think that slapping someone on the beach and picking fights in the middle of the street is something I would teach or something I condone. But it's how they shine. Those were the tactics to exist at the time, and you can condemn it, but you can also question if had they not done that, would we exist today?
Yeah, and that brings up a great point. It seems like, those same behaviors, it's at a certain point, especially in that day and that time, up until very recently, is when you did that, you were representing jiu-jitsu, you were representing my academy, my sect, my tribe. Whereas now it seems like in this age of social media, and now with a lot of money being made, now it's been focused on the personality rather than the organization. Like no one's, I'm doing this for jiu-jitsu anymore. You don't hear that. They're doing it because I'm the man, not my academy. You don't hear that anymore. So how do you feel that it's changed? I mean, what would you say to that?
Become Americanized. So Brazilian judo goes to Brazil. It becomes Brazilian in a lot of ways. It absorbs a lot of Brazilian culture, the machismo culture, the tribal culture, the fight you on the streets if I have to, the shaka, the surf, the acai, all that, right? That's very Brazilian. It comes to the US, it becomes a business. Because remember, there's no money to be made in Brazil. So that's that. But going back to your Creonchi question, that's one of the reasons why Creonchi exists, is because now there's money. So now I have to keep cohesive my group. This is how I pay rent. So there's a money issue now that isn't, that to me, that's where the Creonchi thing comes from. Granted, I think that there should be respect and appreciation for all your coaches, regardless of money. Like these things, money should be secondary. Ought to be, isn't, but ought to be. But when jiu-jitsu comes to America, basically it becomes very Americanized. And what we're watching now with the rise of social media, professional events, we see an American element of something very ingrained in American culture as being added to Brazilian jiu-jitsu. So in some ways, Brazilian jiu-jitsu has become very Americanized. For better or for worse, I'm not even judging here. It just is what it is, but it has become very, very commercial. And the way to sell yourself is to create your own brand. So you're right. It's not about jiu-jitsu. It's not about your team anymore. It's about me, because I can make more money that way. And I think it's a very American feature. Americans are very, very business minded. It's almost one of those things where like, you got to make it. You got to make it. You got to make it. And it's good and bad. It made us the richest country in the world. But at the same time, I think we've lost some of the important values that are very ingrained in Japanese culture, for example, that we don't have. Like, I wonder, like, what survived from Japan and the practice of jiu-jitsu in America. And I can think of the gi. I can't think of anything else. I can't think of anything else that is Japanese that survived and that survives in America today. Like, the bowing, not really. The hierarchy.
The bowing is turned into knuckle bumps, fist bumps, right?
Well, even to enter the mats, like, is the hierarchy really there? Not really. Do we have that enormous respect for senseis? Not really. I mean, what survived? And I see more of a commercial enterprise than that, that ritualistic respect that you still see in judo gyms. And I make this case in my book. Like, I wrote a book about the history of jiu-jitsu. It's coming out too. That I envy judo in a lot of ways, because I feel that there's a respect there that I don't see in the Hakuna Matata culture, because
yeah.
Culture for teenagers, not adults. And I mean, watch the biggest influencers in jiu-jitsu. They're not adults, they're teenagers. They're just, I mean, they happen to be mid-20s. Their behavior.
I think there's definitely something where, because of the business, you add that transactional thing in there. There are some things in judo, like respect and tradition, like you said, bowing. There's certain things I feel like they help the academy create order. Like there's an order of things. There's certain, you respect the elders, you respect the higher belts, you respect the mats. There's certain things that is lost that when I was younger, when I owned my academy, I just opened my academy. I made a mistake of going too far in the opposite directions, thinking, I don't want the traditions in my gym. It's not logical. I never really thought about, where a lot of these traditions, they help harmonize the academy. They help create order. And, I'm starting to realize how important, those Japanese traditions of just even bowing, is how important they are.
I was exactly like you. When I moved to the US, I had what I call the anarchist approach, or the buddy, right? The garage system. Yo, bro, everyone's the same, bro, brah, like, no, you don't have to call me sensei, call me Rob, like I'd sit on the mat with guys and go out for dinner with them all the time. And like, they were my friends, right? Very quickly you learn that there's a reason why, like, the military does things the way they do. It works.
Yeah.
You're trying to be efficient and grow. There's a reason why the military do things, and it's very Japanese style. It's a very disciplined hierarchy, order, systems, respect, and the buddy system is fine if you have like 15, 20 people, 30 people. Maybe you get to a certain number, it doesn't work anymore.
Right.
I never thought I would say this, but the way they do things, like within the military and with the Japanese do things, for example, it works better, the grand scheme of large numbers in a gym. Like, it doesn't. I've tried the other way. Honestly, man, if there's someone that's tried the other way, it was me. It doesn't work.
Me too. And there's no way I have ever in my entire life had more students than you. I didn't work with 120 members. 120 members. If we're all just equals, and I don't mean equals as in we don't have the same ability to do stuff. It's more like everybody is the same. It doesn't matter what belt it just didn't work. It created chaos eventually. There was no respect in the gym, and I had to dial that back and bring back how we lined up and how we bowed and how we call people coach. And I don't know if you do you have your students call you professor?
It's funny, I just changed that recently.
Really?
It was always Rob Drysdale, Rob. Now it's changed recently. I make them call me professor, call me sensei or coach. Like, I think it's important to remind him of the hierarchy. And it's something I thought, it's dumb. Why? It doesn't matter. Respect is something else, but that's not how people are. That's how we wish people were.
You're wishing everybody has the best intentions, but this isn't a popular opinion, but sometimes you have to put some form of control out there. Otherwise, people will act like animals, and that's just the truth. I'll act like an animal. If you don't give me guidelines at your academy, I'm just going to think everything's okay. And that's not, it's a very like entitled opinion. I feel like, if you're not okay with it. So I'm always, when I go to somebody's academy, I always respect the rules, no matter what, even if I think they're ridiculous. It's their academy. They want me to bow, on the knees and stuff. All good, all good. I think that, hopefully that's not going to get lost. It's just respecting somebody else's, academy or space when you visit.
It's better. It's a better system.
Yeah. All right. So Robert, I want to ask you, along the lines of what Jim said about the vibe of jiu-jitsu, how it's different, in the US and whatnot. recently, this isn't recent actually. This is a long time ago, but to me, it was kind of like one of the things that I remember. I think people want to know about it. You had a little bit of a thing with Gordon Ryan and John, right? John Danaher. There was some just misunderstandings, from what I understand. What are you guys cool now? Did everything get settled?
It was funny. Like I bumped into Gordon maybe like 2 or 3 times in my life in person, and he's always he's the opposite of what he is on social media. And then like, oh, that's the real him. I'm like, no, I don't believe that. The real him is the social media part, because that's who he is all the time. I think
Right.
in person is the act. I normally think it's the other way around.
Mm.
But yeah, I think it's a very different approach. I mean, it's exactly what we're talking about. Gordon Ryan incorporates. He reminds me of Kim Kardashian. Like anything to be famous. Paris Hilton. How did Paris Hilton become famous? Right? Now, it's valid. It's okay as long as you make money. So there are no values. As long as you make money, everything is permitted. And if you have that approach and those are your values and that's your worldview, then you'll probably achieve those things and at any cost. I see the world differently. So I'm not suggesting my way is better. I stand by my worldview. I don't think I prefer to live my life like this. I prefer to be around people who think like me. But we're living in an age where you ever think about the fact that there are people who look up to Pablo Escobar? Let that sink in. You see people wearing a Pablo Escobar Let that thought sink in for a second. That's how stupidified that we have become as a people. We are willing to look up to a mass murderer because he made money. So it's okay. Right? I like money too, man. Don't get me wrong. But to look up to Pablo Escobar, I mean, at some point we got, okay, this man was a monster. Kim Kardashian is not a cultural reference. I'm sorry, she's not. She's trash, right? Let's face it. Like Cardi B is trash. I don't care what. There's no way to put it, right? And in some ways, like Gordon incorporates, like he represents that sort of mentality in jiu-jitsu. It's money at any cost. And I'm like, hey man, all the power to you. I wish you all the happiness in the world. That's not what I teach. I don't want to be around people like that. And though that's my main difference, is its approach to what culture we want to create in jiu-jitsu. And we're at a crossroads now in the art where we have this conflict of cultures, right? I think judo lost that war a long time ago. I think it's just going to get worse in the future. But
that kind of behavior, you get kicked out of your dojo in 5 seconds. So it's kind of strange, but I get it. I'm a business owner, I'm an entrepreneur, I get it. But then I'm like, is that the legacy you want to leave? Is that the example you want to set? 50 years from now, are you going to look back on that and think, this is all public now? Is this what I wanted to do? So I do more side with you on the humility side of things. But I also do understand. I see both sides, I guess, and I don't pick a right and a wrong. It's more like just do you.
And just to add a thing, a lot of times, like when I suggest that we should have a different approach, it doesn't mean I'm an angel. It doesn't mean I'm perfect, right? A lot of people are like, oh, you're not perfect. No, clearly, I've made a bunch of mistakes in my life. I'm not suggesting I'm an angel. I suggest and I have a different north. Yeah. I know where I want to sail. Whereas, like, there's an agreement that that people have different, aspirations and on how they ought to be. But, it's something that, we're all flawed, and that goes for everyone.
Right. Another thing I want to ask you, Robert, was I've always been curious of this. You are half Caucasian and half Brazilian, correct?
Yeah. Well, my family in Brazil, they're all Italians. So
okay.
Italian Brazilian. Like everyone in my family in Brazil is both sides of the family, all Italians, and then on my American side, English and Scottish.
Okay. So do you ever get any I guess do you ever get any crap for being, half Brazilian, half white, and having the opinions that you have?
All the time.
All the time?
Oh, my whole life.
Well, what are some examples and why? I knew this. You were going to say yes, but I'm always curious. Like, what is it? Why do people have a problem with this?
Because I tend to approach things. Let's think from a historical perspective. Let's take the history, for example. The purpose of historians is to tell history accurately, right? Pragmatically, objectively. It's not to take sides. If you're telling history with an ideological bias, you're not being a good historian. If you're telling history with a patriotical bias, you're not being a good historian. The only passion you're allowed as a historian is to tell history accurately, pragmatically, objectively. And the only passion you're really allowed is the search for the truth. That's the only thing a historian is allowed, right? And I've always had that approach towards things. So of course, when I make a criticism of anything in the United States, clearly Robert's really a Brazilian. That's why he says that. In Brazil, the second I say something, well, there was no technical development in Brazil until the 90s. They were really just doing judo. Oh, clearly Robert's just part of the American jiu-jitsu movement. He hates Brazil, you can't win. Like I suspect that if people read my book, they're gonna think I'm pro-Japanese. I swear I'm not Japanese. There's no Japanese in my family anywhere. I come across as pro-Japanese, even though I've never lived in Japan. I don't speak a word in Japanese. So I think I'm not saying I'm always unbiased, but I try to be, and as a result, you come across as a hater in both countries.
Yeah, yeah. I expected this. It's like if you're in America and you're a middle-leaning person, right? You get attacked on by both sides, and that's kind of this similar example. Okay. Another question I had was this is just something I'm curious of, and I think the MMA world is curious of. You had a fighter in the UFC. His name was Max Reshkov, and he was released from the UFC. I'll tell the story real quick. He was in a fight. It was a prelim fight, and he's facing a guy named Austin. I forgot his name, but Max was fighting this guy, Austin Hubbard. Yeah. And he took the fight on like a couple days notice, like 5 days notice. And maybe the stage was too big for him. He got a little gassed out. He got a little unsure of himself, and he chose to stop the fight in round 3 before round 3 started. And while you were constantly trying to motivate him and trying to get his head back into the game, and my opinion, before I let you speak on it, was that was exactly the right thing to do. There are certain doors that you don't want to have to open unless you really have to open them. And he, at the end of the day, he made that choice. My question to you, we already kind of know what happened, and your initial your thoughts on it. We've heard that. Has anything changed? What's the next step for Max, and has your opinion on the matter changed over time?
No, the only thing I regret that day is not pushing him harder. The only thing I regret is my choice of words. That's the only thing I regret. I chose the wrong word. I was caught off guard. I didn't expect that. So the go, let's go. Those are not, when you're a coach, one thing you learn, you're a coach, this, you're also a mind mechanic. It's not,
yes.
The best trait a coach could have is not technique. It's being a good psychologist. That's yes. The best, especially in a crucial moment of his life, not just his career, but his life in general. With that 1 minute on that stool, if I had a time machine, I would have had a better choice of words. I would have tried to fix his mind in a way where I tapped into his emotion and got that spark, going again, like get that car running again, sort of thing, because he was mentally defeated. And my choice of words were very poor, largely because I was caught off guard and there's no time for thinking or preparing for something like that. But I don't regret push. I think the people that threw me under the bus and accuse me of being a bad coach are a bunch of idiots. I just don't know how else to say it, but they're morons.
No, I agree. I don't think anybody that people that said that, they're probably not fighters and they're not coaches, and there's no accountability, and you can't make that swipe on the internet, and you're not a fighter and you're not a coach. How are you going to make that comment? So but I do say that also with people that criticize Max or you or anybody that thinks the situation wasn't handled right, is that these things, they can happen. We don't see, this is what was his 5th or 6th fight, I think. There's fighters in the UFC that are, Pride, whoever, that fought, long careers. We see them at their 20th fight. We don't see their 5th fight. And a lot of these things are now broadcasted, early. He's a young guy. Can he, what do you think? I think absolutely, but Do you think he can come back from this? What's his next step to getting back to the UFC? Because I want to see him back.
Well, I think that here, I'll be honest with you. Like, I didn't want to coach MMA. I was not coaching people. Max knocked on my door about 3 years ago. He's lived with me. Like, he became like a little brother. And I say this sincerely. I've trained 5 UFC champions in my life. I have been around successful athletes in both jiu-jitsu and MMA. Max may be the most talented person I've ever met, or up there. Kid's a phenom. Good hands, good wrestling, good jiu-jitsu, good athletics, good mindset. Except that he does not know how to deal with things not going his way, and that's an Achilles heel that we need to fix. It came across in the fight because I think I'll take my share of the blame. I think I was a little overconfident about what Max could do in his 5th, 6th fight inside the UFC. We took a short notice, which is something I think we should have had a more conservative approach because of that. But Max was like, I'm not going to mention names, but I've seen top 5, top 10 contenders in the UFC walk in the gym, and Max takes them down 3 times in a 5-minute round and taps them 3 times in 5 minutes, over and over and over. I've seen him do that. So I'm just thinking to myself, like, well, it's not going to be different today, right? It's just that it's the UFC. The lights are on. It's a big show. It's 5 days notice. His cardio wasn't there. The overconfidence led to him to poor strategy, which led to him getting tired, which led to mental frustration, right? Which led to him breaking on the stool. And that's what happened. And it's an issue that I think that with a good camp could be fixed. But the question is, does he want to do it at this point? Like, it's entirely his decision. Like, I'm here, but I can't. My job as a coach is to train you when you're inside the gym. I'm not going to walk you through the door. Your job as an athlete, I always tell my fighters, it's the only thing you have to do is walk through that door. Everything else is on me. Walk through that door every day and I'll do my magic. All you got to do is walk through that door, but you got to do it every day, twice a day. Deal? Surprisingly, 99% of people can't do it.
Wow.
Yeah, I've noticed that they're some of the most talented jiu-jitsu people I've ever trained with or trained. They tend to, how do I put this? They tend to do very well when things are going their way, but maybe they're so talented that they're not in any adversity because everything just goes so well. I don't know what that feels like because I started jiu-jitsu, getting my ass kicked for 5 years, but some people start jiu-jitsu from day one. Maybe they started with wrestling first, and then they start jiu-jitsu from day one to present day. Black belts have a tough time against them, and they're beating everybody in the gym. So it's really hard when you have that kind of athlete, and I've had a lot of those athletes. How do you get them to face their adversity?
It's difficult because, I'll give you an example. Like, it's like that kid who was like, he starts training when he's 4 and his dad takes him to all the Naga tournaments and he wins like 1,000 Naga swords. You know that kid, right? Everyone knows like 5 of those kids. And they're phenoms and they're going to be the next UFC champion and they're killing everyone. And then they get to the years where it really matters. 16, 17, 18, that's when the real competition begins, right? And then they lose. You know what happens to the kid? Holy shit.
They quit.
All the time. How many times have you seen that movie? Because they don't know how to deal with losses. Like, and it's I tell parents this, they think I'm nuts, and I'm right, and I know what I'm talking about. You don't want your kid winning all the time. You want him to lose about half the time. And it sounds like, why would you, if I had a kid that were really talented and he would kill in his division, I would throw him in a division of heavier and bigger kids, better kids, just so he'd lose every now and then. And like, you're nuts. I'm like, no. That they need to learn how to deal with that early on to see, like, hey, man, you're gonna win some, you're gonna lose some, because you're right. If you're only used to winning, and that's the kind of problem with Max. He's so used to winning, it kind of like threw him off. Oh, what? I lost a round? Holy shit! I didn't know I could lose a round because he's so dominating in the gym, right? Fight's a different thing. All these things change, and I think that losing is a key element of a fight. Like, you have to go through that, man. And even like the guys who have amazing adult careers, I think if you dig deep in their childhood, I think they lost a lot of matches as children. And I think that might be one of the elements of success, is that they know how to deal with frustration.
Yeah, I'm curious, maybe we can get Mikey Musumeci on here one of these days. He was one of those kids that would win all the Nagas. And I'm curious how he became such a, big star and so dominant. There must have been something in his mindset.
Mikey's special. I don't know if you guys ever spent a lot of time talking to him. He's a very, very special kid, man. Like there is wisdom in that kid that I did not reach until after my career ended. And he's like 23 years old, and he's dropping like Yoda level bombs on me.
Share with us some of this stuff, Robert.
And like we had him on our podcast, me and David Alvin, like a few months ago, maybe a year ago. And he's just incredibly mature for his age, I feel like. And he's not speaking out of his ass. Like, it's not out of, he's very sincere about it. You can tell he's a very sincere person. He's very highly intelligent in the way that it matters for fighting. If you begin intelligent in ways, it doesn't mean anything to fight. He's very intelligent in the way where he knows very well how to deal with emotion. I remember like one time, my favorite part of the interview was something like how to deal with doubt, right? Because everyone has doubt. Am I going to win? Am I going to lose? Are people going to love me? Are people going to hate me? Like we're thinking about all this. So it shouldn't matter, right? But it does. Like we can't help. It's almost like we're victims of our own anxiety. Like we can't help, but like you can't get rid of it. And, you know, I was discussing with Mikey techniques that I've developed over the years to deal with this stuff. And at some point he goes like, yeah, and there's fear, anxiety, and it's there, but you just move it out of the way and you focus on the mission. And it's something so simple, but it's like people spend their lives trying to do what he just did. He basically, like, I think he even used his hands. Like, yeah, you just move it out of the way.
Yeah, it sounds like he acknowledges it and doesn't deny it.
Object, and to him, it's just like an object that's in the way. You just move it out of the way, and you focus on the mission. To something that to him may come easier than others, maybe, but some people spend their whole lives trying to deal with that, and they can't. Like I struggled with it till from my first fight until my last fight. I never completely learned how to deal with it. Like it's something I struggle with always. And for Mikey's age, he's surprisingly mature in that regard.
Yeah, I've always dealt with it too, and I've always looked for ways. I think it's taken a long time for me to learn this, but I've always looked for ways to not feel that, to kind of look for solutions to that fear or that anxiety. And really, I don't think there are any real solutions. You just have to face it. You just have to accept it. And I think all the top competitors that I've talked to, you included, I think you guys all say the same thing. It's just it never goes away. You accept it and you move it to the side and you continue. And that's great, man. I'm really happy that Jim, do you notice that our guests all kind of have the same overall mindset? And I think the trend is that they all seek the truth. And why is it that our guests are at the highest level, right? I think that's something, and that's something that me and Jim talk a lot about, Robert, is people that are the highest performers. They don't let their ego get in the way of the truth. And that I think is you definitely have it. I can tell, there's no secret. You don't have any secret that I can't tell is why is this guy so successful in jiu-jitsu, at life and all that stuff. It's because he embraces the truth. He's unbiased. He understands logic, and this is just it's just so common. It's one trend that I notice with literally every single guest that we have that's a high performer. So yeah.
And this brings us back to a full circle moment right here to the Closed Guard documentary. What is it? It's essentially the canon for someone's jiu-jitsu journey or people who are already in it. It serves as an anchor point of this is where you come from, and it's all that right there. It's an effort to kind of unravel and have a better understanding of what really happened, the truth of the matter. And I think once people have that, then they can make better decisions moving forward based off of the historical truth of the past, right?
Yeah, I've always been of the opinion that the truth is good enough, right? And if you don't like the truth, then you have a problem, not the truth.
Right.
Yeah.
So do we have a release date? It was supposed to be this past summer, but I assume a lot of pandemic issues have backed up the whole entire world. But you mentioned copyrights.
Sorry to interrupt. Like this is the decision we came down. We can either release the film now and miss out on some pretty cool images, or we can wait a little longer and make it the masterpiece we want it to be, right? We opted for the latter. Like we want this to be an archival film. One thing very special about our film, and this came along, I realized this somewhere like mid-production, was that we're in a very unique place in history. There's a reason why there's been all this talk about jiu-jitsu history in the last few years, and there was none before that, is because there were no sources. The Brazilian National Library digitized their files in 2012, more or less. So after that, there's this renaissance of research, and now we know a lot more than we did before, because before it all came down to Carlos Grace's testimony. It's whatever Carlos said is what happened. We had one testimony. Now we have many sources, right? So it's broadened it's enriched the story a lot more. But at the same time, the grandmasters who were part of the first generation of what we call Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, the first generation of practitioners, they're all dying, right? They're all in their 80s and 90s. So we are a very unique place in time where we have the research and the masters are still alive. It's a very small window. So I don't think this documentary will be redone in 10 years from now, like 15 years from now, 20 years from now. You can't redo it unless you only have historians, and you're only going to have historians, but you're going to miss out on some of the people that live these events. So it's a very unique place. We're very privileged in that regard, and for that reason, we wanted to make it right. We don't want it to be, and we have 90 minutes to do, and that's been the biggest challenge, is condensing everything into 90 minutes, and that's not easy to do while being entertaining. Because if you bombard people with too much information, you're going to lose them. So you got to make it entertaining at the same time.
And 90 minutes is quite long for a jiu-jitsu documentary. You know, it's pretty long. Where can people? Do you have a website or a social media? Where can people follow along, and where will it be released?
So it's on our website. It's closeguardfilm.com. Initially, we're going to launch it on our own platform. Later, we're open to some, other ideas. But right now, it's going to be on our own platform. We should be done soon. I don't want to give a date, guys. I apologize. I don't want to give a date because some of these holdups, they're not up to us, right? They're things that are out of our control. It just when we said summer of 2020 back in March, I think February, March is when we said that. I had no idea this pandemic was going to go all the way through September, October. I'm like, there's no way it's going to make it to June. That's in my head. We're not going to June. We're going to be done for sure. So if a library in Japan doesn't return my email, like, what am I going to do? I can just skip the image, or I can wait. And I think that things are starting to get back to normal. So that's been one of the problems we have. It's not the only problem, but I think before the end of the year is a very, very fair thing to say. In the meantime, I did write a book that expands on the film in a lot of ways, because the film has, its constraints. It's 90 minutes. I was able to expand on some of the arguments, provide some sources and some references, and kind of like talk about the history of jiu-jitsu in a more dense way. So for people that really like this history, I recommend, the book with the film. So it's a more complete account. Not everyone likes it.
What is the book called, Robert?
Opening Close Guard.
Opening Close Guard. And it'll be on Amazon?
It's on the website right now, pre-sale. We're going to print in a week. So we should be out for distribution. Like I said, October 1st, but it might be first week of October. It's been on sale already. It's just going out, first week of October.
So the book will come out regardless. That's a go.
It's done. It's just that it's going to print right now. So we're going to print, mass print. But the book is ready. It's not 100%.
And that'll serve as a very cool companion to the documentary when that comes out, and it'll probably enhance the experience. Yeah, having the book.
The idea is for people. Like, here's the thing: most people aren't they'll watch a documentary. Everyone who loves jiu-jitsu would watch a 90-minute documentary. Not everyone's going to read a book on it. I think, but maybe 5-10% of the community that would read a book that's going to teach them something about the history of jiu-jitsu. So that's who I'm targeting. So the book is there for that, but it does expand. It does enrich the experience. Just like most, I don't care how much you love the movie, the book is always better, right?
Right.
Always the case. And I think in some ways the book, I'm not going to say it's better than the film. I think it is. Maybe it has more information. Like, I think that to me, it's information that I'm after, right? Not just aesthetics. It's information that counts. So it's very rich in that regard. But yeah, I hope people like it. Hopefully.
All right. Cool. So thanks again, Robert. Thank you for being here. Do you have anything else you want to mention? Any people you want to thank? Your
No,
academy?
I wanted to thank. I hope that the jiu-jitsu community supports this. I feel bad because I've been promising this for so long, but some things are not in my power, in my opinion. My lack of experience maybe played a role here. I could have foreseen some problems that I'm a rookie executive producer, and I got thrown into the eye of the storm and of the hurricane, and I'm trying to deal with all these things, and it's all new to me, and I'm doing my best. But there's nothing. It's everything has always been with the best of intentions. Like, I love history, I love jiu-jitsu, and I think that what has been done to men like Gio Amori, Takeo Yano, the Ono brothers, George Gracie, has been an enormous injustice that people don't know their names. They were very important people. They were good people. They were good fighters, and they played a role. So they should be remembered.
Awesome. Jim, any last words?
Nope, that's it. Professor Drysdale, we appreciate you taking the time out there. I'm just messing with you, but we appreciate you taking the time to join us, talk about your project. You and I, we've been talking. I've been hearing about this for quite some time now, and I've been excited for it. So I'm looking forward to the release. If they want to follow you, it's should they go to your personal Instagram account, or would you rather just go to the site to find out more about this?
Well, my personal is Robert Drysdale, JJ. I'm mostly on Instagram. I'm not very active on Facebook. The film is closeguardfilm.com. We'll find us on social media. I'm pretty active for the most part. Right. And yeah, for everyone in Vegas, anyone listening, I'm not very political when it comes to jiu-jitsu. People are always welcome in my gym. I enjoyed this. Thank you for having me. Maybe after I'll send you guys a copy of the book, and you guys, after you guys read the book, watch the film, we can do another one. You guys can maybe give me your thoughts on what you guys thought.
That sounds great, and I don't want it unless it's autographed, but it sounds good.
All right. Thank you, Robert.
All right, Robert. Thank you, guys. Take care.
Ciao.
All right. So